Good morning. Welcome to our webinar on the cyber kill chain, presented by Proximus and Trend Micro. My name is Bastian Germs and I am a pre-sales for security at Proximus. Today, Don Eijndhoven will be our guest speaker. He is CEO of Argent Consulting, management consultancy firm specialized in cybersecurity. Over 20 years of experience he has as an interim CISO and an enterprise security architect. And Don is also the founder of the Dutch cyber warfare community. Let's get started. I would like to give the floor now to Don Eijndhoven.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you, Trend Micro and Proximus, for inviting me. I'm Don. Glad to be here. Today. I will be talking about cyber warfare, which is a relatively new affair on the stage of global politics, and it has far-reaching consequences for us in the security field as a whole, because basically it's what we already did, but on steroids. So let me start off. What it comes down to is that ever since governments of the world discovered the benefits of, they've basically been working on ways to exploit it and benefit from that as a country. Every country has had its very own way of doing that, of achieving those goals. Of course, they're on digging deeper on that and getting more benefit out of it in ways that suit them specifically. There's a couple of usual suspects that we talk about: China, Russia, Iran, the bigger countries on the stage that we here in the West have a lot of negative contact with. So that's easy to focus on. For some example, China, I could have just as easily used Russia or Iran or the UK or even the Netherlands. There's plenty of gains to be had in the whole cyber field. So basically, for us in the security field, it means that we now have a new adversary, one with very deep pockets, one with a lot of capabilities and resources. And yeah, that has a lot of repercussions to us in the security field. And basically, this put the security industry as a whole on attention, and they really have to step up their game. The good news is that this has actually happened. So we are now seeing new security products that I would almost have killed for 10 years ago. And this talk will basically be covering why that is, what's going on, what we see, and provide a little more in-depth explanation so that you know how we're thinking and what kind of tools to defend you. So let's start off. You know, I made a rather big statement saying, okay, governments are doing this, so in it for them. Well, in some cases, it's very tactile. I'd like to start off with a little game here, and if you could just point out to me in your own mind which is the actual real F-22 Raptor, and which is the fake. And I say fake because the other aircraft be fine. It's not just a cheap knockoff. So in case you were wondering, it is the aircraft on the left that is the actual American developed F-22 Raptor, next generation fighter jet, and the one on the right is actually the Chengdu J-20, and it is not just an F-22 ripoff. It is actually a very, very good aircraft developed by blending the for 5 different next generation fighters that are incorporated into each other, and this is the result. This picture doesn't really show it, but the aircraft is about 30% larger than the F-22 Raptor, and it has an entirely different set of specs and has a different role as well, because the J-20 that you see here is not a fighter jet, but it is actually intended to just have a large storage capacity for fuel, so they can stay above the Chinese mainland and defend it for a long period of time. And the F-22 about an active flying time of 20 minutes, I think, in dogfights. So they have to refuel, and this one does not. So different role, but based on the very same characteristics. That's why the air intake on both of these craft are so similar. That's not a coincidence. It's because it was derived from stealing this data from the network of the company that built it. And the same game can be done for something a little closer to home. This is the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, especially in my home country of the Netherlands. There's been a lot to do about this. I think we've been trying to perfect this plane for the last 5, maybe 10 years, and it's gone over budget 2 or 3 times, I think, or maybe even more. And the other picture here, and again, I'll have you guess which one it is the Chinese version, which is actually in this case more of a knockoff because it was really only intended to be a copy of the F-35. I'll eliminate the suspense for you. It is the one on the left. And for those that are really paying attention, you'll notice that it has 2 engines in the back and not just the one. And this picture will show that a little clearer. It is the Shenyang J-31, which, was found to be flying rather well, where we were still fighting with the first kinks in the cable, like poor air intake and stuff like that. So, apparently stealing this material from the company that develops it is a very good way to very cheaply develop your army, develop your military capabilities. So this is a very tactile example of what the gain can be if you realize that developing a next generation fighter jet for any role is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it takes decades to perfect it. And now they've had it for a couple of years and maybe 10, 20 million in research and development and hacking costs. So yeah, there's a great gain to be had by playing this game. So this is the stuff why governments do this, right? They enrich themselves at the cost of all the other players on the stage. And in some cases it's information, in others it's R&D, and sometimes it's just pure power. So this is the game that governments play, and what we see here down the line is that even when we are not directly in the line of fire as a commercial party, for instance, if we don't involve ourselves with developing military weapons, but do something entirely different, we still get faced with the repercussions of what governments do on the internet. And one of them is the malware that they produce, because we do that too, by the way, and by we, I mean us here in the Western democratic world. We too develop malware to be able to attack a certain network, and sometimes that is turned against us. In case of the WannaCry outbreak that we had here in the Netherlands and in a couple of other countries as well, that was actually developed by NSA originally, called Eternal Blue, and that was turned into WannaCry by the Russian government, and that in turn was turned into Petya, or not Petya. You also see the downside of doing an attack against the Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities in Natanz, which was dubbed Stuxnet, the virus that was used for that. And what happened is that once this virus became spreading into the wild, as they call it, cyber criminals also took up this malware, and they basically took it, rearranged it, added to it, subtracted to it, and called it something different, like Flame or DQ or Gauss. And these were then used for cyber criminal gains, and very off spec for what the US and Israel had intended when they originally wrote the code. You can call it an accident, basically. Not entirely sure if this was predicted. I doubt it, because if you look at Stuxnet itself, it was very, very targeted, very specialistic, and you would really only be presented with the full blast of the weapon if you were actually running the Siemens PLCs that were present in the configuration as they are in Natanz in Iran. So this was very targeted, a very surgical strike, and even then, it has the downside of having the virus out in the wild, where it can be re-engineered and put into play by other parties. And the same goes for Triton and Black Energy. black energy is the malware that was found on power plants, especially in the Ukraine, when they were disabled a couple of years ago, when they were in conflict with Russia, which basically they still are. We just don't hear a lot about it anymore. And finally, I mean, Iran is moving in this field as well. You may have heard earlier this year about the actual shelling, the actual targeting of Aramco, the Saudi oil company. It was actually targeted, bombarded with missiles, and that was the end of a longer discussion between Iran and the Saudi state, and they had tried to disable that company previous with Shamoon, a malware specifically designed to turn all the PCs to black, and then again a couple years later with its predecessor Shamoon 2, and apparently the Iranian government decided that just disabling their computers wasn't good enough, and they sent a few missiles in to finish the job. That's something that we can none of us can prevent, but fortunately we're not in their position. But what you can see is that governments do develop malware. It doesn't always remain in their control, and you, as the defender of a company and its infrastructure, will have to deal with this at some point. And whether or not you're directly in the line of fire, it doesn't really matter anymore. So what we do in the security industry is basically try to come up with dichotomies and tactics and procedures on how to deal with the threats that we see. And to do that, we have to dissect them. And especially when you look at the term of an ATP, Advanced Persistent Threat, APT, sorry, this is one of such initiatives. And what basically APT was basically the, how shall I put this, the socially responsible label that we had to put on attacks that were generally from China against companies. And this was just a political way of saying, hey, we're dealing with China. This is an advanced persistent threat. And what they did is they took a lot of attacks, like 500 or 600 attacks. They dissected them and then found that there are 7 phases that every cyber attack goes through. And this is known now as the cyber kill chain. And this here is a rather graphical representation of that. And what it means is that every attack goes through a number of phases that lead to the next step, that lead to eventual execution of the order that is given. And in this case, in this slide, it is the exfiltration of data, but it can also be determination of a system. It can be whatever the attacker wants it to be once it has this level of control. So this usually starts with the recon phase, where they say, okay, who am I dealing with? What IP space do they own? What domains are registered to this company? What are the players? Who's the CEO? Who's the CFO? Who manages the networks? Who manages the system? So they do a lot of recon work to really thoroughly understand you as a target. And then they, in the next phase, in weaponization, they actually start developing weapons specifically aimed for you. So they'll take that malware that they have on the shelves, they'll re-engineer it to work with the network equipment that you have, or the software or the hardware that you have in your network infrastructure, and then they'll start pounding you, and that is where delivery comes in. So any kind of attack, of course, needs a delivery vehicle. In case of phishing, that vehicle is email, but it can also be a direct server connection, one-on-one, where they connect to your server specifically over an IP, and just start bashing at a port or the service behind that. And when they have done their homework properly, they'll get through because they know what you run, they know what it's vulnerable to, and then they'll ram an exploit against it, and it will breach, and they'll be on your network. Once they do that, they almost always already have root privileges. If they don't have that yet, that's the next target on their list. So they'll install their malware, they'll escalate their privileges from whatever user they have up to root, so they can freely install whatever they like on that system. And from there on, a command and control is established, which means that they have penetrated your network defenses, they're on the system, they have root privileges, and then they call home and say, okay, hey, listen, I'm here. I'm ready for orders. And if you want to break off connection now and reestablish it later, you can do that. So that's basically the essence of a command and control. From there, they move laterally, and they generally search through your network to see whatever could be found, how they can exploit it maximally. They usually repeat this whole process against other servers in your network and establish like a whole network of malicious systems in your network and start with whatever goal they had intended, like exfiltrating data. And the entire cycle of this is just repeated over and over with the express intent not of hitting you once and leaving, but of hitting you and staying and deriving the data over time, which is, as you can understand, rather problematic for us as defenders, because at what point is our network breached? Because if they do it successfully, we don't see anything. And at what point can we no longer trust the network as it is? So this causes great dilemmas for us as security providers to deal with. So I've already briefly mentioned this, but why the traditional incident response doesn't really always work is because of what they call pivoting. And this works as follows. This is just one example of your average attack using pivots. So here depicted now is your average network where a user works from home with his laptop. He connects through the internet, connects to your web server, for instance. It itself is connected to a database server behind that, which is connected to a database or a storage, and that is your average network. So what an attacker will do is it will target the one individual and send him malware through a phishing attack. If that person clicks that and opens that file or clicks that link, his system is infected. It can then be used to traverse the same path that the user normally would, and he would connect to that server under the privileges of that user, and they would break out of that confinement with another exploit on that service, and then they basically say, hey, to the server, download more malware, and then give the attacker full control over the system. This is where it gets kind of technical, but this is the difference between a dropper and a loader and all the various components that malware consists of. And it can be really quite basic. The start of a malware infection on a system can be as small as a couple of 100K, so really quite small. And once if that's successful, the system will then be told, hey, download the rest of the virus and dial in when you're done. And then the attacker knows, hey, I can proceed with my attack because it's all worked so far. And from there, he'll start deploying beacons. And beacons are basically additional shells that he can use to get back into the network. So in this example, he already has an exploited session running, and he installs a second one, which is use the beacon. He deploys that beacon there, and he can use it. Now he can use his original access or that beacon. So he has a second path into that system, and then he keeps on exploiting the network further and further until he gets what he wants, which might be research data or your entire Active Directory or all of the user information on there or credit card information that you might have stored, whatever is tasty at that moment for that attacker. So connect through to the database here and maybe find some credentials there that you can use on a different server. Then he'll hop on to that server and he'll install a beacon there as well. And they both give him back a command and control line. So why this is problematic for defenders is because, okay, so in the best case scenario, the user realizes that he did something that he shouldn't have done, right? He clicked a link, he opened something that he instinctively feels this is probably not the best move I've ever made, but it's 9 p.m, never mind, I'll call tomorrow when the service desk is in and I'll report it. At that point, the service desk will say, okay, well, if you don't trust it, we'll just change your password and then your account can't be used anymore. Now, meanwhile, remember that the attackers had all night to take that account, those account credentials that the user provided him with after clicking that malware, and log into. But he's already deployed and he's already promoted himself to the root level access, and then he deployed beacons, and then he got basically all of the other accounts stored in that network. So he doesn't need the original user anymore. So just disabling that user account or changing his password, it might give you a sense of freedom or a sense of relief, but in truth, he's already compromised 90% of your network, and what you've just done will not limit the attacker in any way. So this is your average attack today, and it uses the people in your network. So that's why security awareness is so important, because any one of the people in your company can open up the proverbial the castle gates to allow an attacker in. After that is done, your firewall will no longer see this person as an external party because it's already on the inside of the network. And most companies still don't monitor the data that goes out of their network, so they'll never see data being exfiltrated because they're only focused on threats coming from outside in. And this is not new. This is something that the security industry has known for 10, maybe 15 years, but it is still very common. So, going back to that cyber kill chain, this might not look like what I described previously, but it actually is. Because if you put them in a chronological order, it'll all become clear. So this is the timeline of the cyber kill chain, right? So we start from T0 all the way down to the final moments of the attacker on your network. He goes through the reconnaissance phase, weaponization phase, delivery phase, and then he starts actually, at that point, he gets into your network. And that is the red line representing there. And the rest of the steps are stuff that you should be able to see as a network defender. And this is also a good way to start layering your defenses, because the various things that we do prevent certain actions in this cyber kill chain specifically. And if any one of those links breaks, then the attack fails. So this is the good news for us as defenders, because if we, for instance, can prevent the attacker from attaining any kind of information about our network, then he won't know where to aim his attack. So if we don't give him the IPs or the website address of our company or anything like that, then he can never mount his attack at all. Now, of course, this is of very limited use because most of this data is freely available and very hard, if not impossible, for us to withhold from the attacker. But you get the drift, right? So all of these phases can be broken, and all of these phases have defenses that are specifically useful to prevent whatever the attacker at that point wants to do. Like security awareness and cyber hygiene, they work very well at the beginning of this timeline. And having a network awareness and hardening each system makes it a lot more difficult for an attacker to not breach the network, but to get further into your network, because every system is hardened, so every system is a new battle. And this is not usually done, but it should be, because it really slows an attacker down, and it gives your defenders a lot more time to actually mount their defenses, to become alerted, saying, hey, we have someone on our network that doesn't belong there, let's take some actions. And you can't fight what you can't see. So network awareness is very important. You need tripwire senses, that page you when something is wrong, and again, screen your outbound traffic and look at what goes out of your network and where it goes to. But that's also very important. These days we have very capable threat intelligence feeds. And what it does is it provides your systems with the knowledge that, hey, if a connection is set to this IP that was used previously in a DDoS attack, then we know this system might be compromised with malware. So if we see a line connect to that and another 100 like it, that's probably bad news, right? So we probably should alert someone at that point. And all of these controls are now, put in a certain context that should help you with prioritizing on what is important and to define for yourself what your weak points are, where you might not have done as much as you could. So, this is a constant cat and mouse game. I understand that, but the more important point is to be able to look at the bigger picture and see the context that we operate in and why we do the things we do. So, just recapping it. So what you need to deal with the attacker that I just described is one centralized, or preferably one centralized system that ties into all of your security defenses, that gathers this data and can correlate between events. And this is basically what SIEM is all about: security incident events management. And it just takes all the data from all the different systems and say, okay, so if I see 20 attempted logins from this account, then I see one succeeded, or 10,000 and one succeeded, and then I see this account logging in on that server, listing the index for all of these files, and then on my firewall I see a lot of data going out that correlates with that data that was just discovered by the attacker apparently. This is reason to strike an alarm. So separately, these things might not raise to the level of an alarm, but if you don't bring them together, you'll never see the correlation between these events, and you'll never be triggered to act. So that's why next generation security software and applications and appliances, they look for this kind of integration, and that is crucial if you want to have any kind of chance to defend yourself these days. So we're approaching, I think, the edge of my time, so I'll start to wrapping up. When you look at SIEM and SOAR now, security orchestration, these are not just buzzwords, right? These are terminologies that underlie huge layers of, or huge advances in technologies that we use. And again, you need the interconnection between not just your security controls, but your IT as a whole, because the correlation gives you power to detect things that you would otherwise miss. And one of the most crucial things here, I have a friend of mine. He's always very jaded, and he can bring things very tersely. He says, well, SIEM is the act of having a log files on 20 machines where you ignore them, and you bring them together on one system where you ignore them. Now, obviously, you should not do that, right? So if you implement a SIEM, then get someone to watch it and actually deliver on it, and write business cases and the use cases and say, okay, so if this happens, what should we do? Who should start acting? What kind of indicators of compromise do we want to have in there? Will we buy a feed from a company that researches and develops this? Do we want to go out of the box? Do we trust one vendor to provide this, or do we want multiple? All of these are questions that these days really need to be answered. You can no longer function by just having a firewall and some anti-malware on the clients. You need more of that. And artificial intelligence, for instance, is still quite expensive, but the advantages of this, watching the systems and correlating events, can be done by an artificial intelligence, at least in theory, and it will eventually might lead to not having to man your security operations center at all anymore. It can all be AI. It can all be driven by just a few people and a few clicks on a maintenance fee-based solution. I don't know what the future will bring, but artificial intelligence will definitely play a role in the security world, because looking at feeds, and it's not easy work. It's hard, and it's repetitive, and it's boring, to be honest. It requires a high level of skill, and it doesn't offer a lot of variation in work. So you see a high turnover in staff, because it's labor intensive, but it's not very exciting. And if we can solve it by having computers do it, then that would definitely help. So the industry is looking at this very hard. And again, threat intelligence, as a wrap up, is we need the indicators of compromise. Just to briefly illustrate what this means, is what security industry does is it takes malware that it finds in the wild, it dissects that malware and looks to see where a system, once compromised, will connect to, because that IP or URL is of interest for security industry, because we know that if we see activity going to that IP or to that URL, you have an indicator of compromise right there. Your system is owned, and you need to fix it. So what these threat intelligence feed do is that's what they send you. Say, hey, this IP, these IPs, these URLs, if you see them on your firewall, you have a problem. And it's like steroids for indicators of compromise. And it's really worthwhile of getting it once you have the SIEM and SOAR in place. So I'm looking at the end of my time. So I think I am ready for questions. Are there any questions at this time?
Thank you, Don, for your presentation. And thank you all for attending this webinar. Indeed, it's time for questions. So if you have any questions, ask them via the chat function. We will stay online to answer your questions. Also, if you would like to get more information, you can always go to proximus.be/securitycontact, also to get in contact with anyone if you would like to. Christophe, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have some questions already popping up. I already have an anti-malware solution to keep the malware outside. Does this mean the solution on my endpoint is not enough?
Well, it depends on who you're facing, really. I do a lot of consultancy work, and I'll just give you an example that hopefully illustrates an answer to your question. So the company that I worked for, they really were in a high stakes game for bids in the work that they did. So they said, well, listen, Don, we have the feeling that we get targeted now and then. And what we don't want to have is to be presented with some unknown malware that is specifically crafted for us, because we feel we might not be able to prevent that from getting through our defenses. So what I did is basically stack a load of defenses, which is always a good idea. In this particular case, they had their email on Office 365, and Microsoft has a solution that at least attempts a filtering of all the emails coming into their Exchange environment. And if anything comes in that is malicious, then hopefully Microsoft will catch it. If it doesn't, then we still have a firewall that also inspects mail coming in and attachments there, and it's on a separate feed by a separate security firm with their own research and their own indicators of compromise database, and so they might catch it. And if they don't catch it, then at least on every endpoint there was McAfee in that particular case, and once a user would open a file, it would first sandbox that file. They call that exploding. Explode the file, see what it does, and if something is malicious, then you don't want to do this on the actual system, and it would never be able to run, and therefore prevent the execution of the malware on that system. So you have a 3 staggered defense there, and in that 2 or 3 months that I was there, this was up and running, we caught 5 or 6 different instances of malware that were specifically crafted for that company. So none of those 3 found it natively because it was custom made for that one client. And the only reason it was not executed on the endpoint was because of the endpoint's settings, that it would first sandbox that. So yeah, I mean, there is definitely gain in just endpoint security, but it shouldn't be all of it that you run. It should be a multitude of things. So the short answer is you're not entirely secure by just having endpoint security. You should see it as one weapon of war, while you need a whole arsenal these days.
I see another question coming in. Is the trend going through a 3-layer approach? Network DNS solution, agent in the router, and endpoint solution? Or is this overkill?
Well, I mean, it's not overkill. Basically, it really depends on, how to rephrase this before I put my foot in my mouth. Every company or every organization should, do an honest self-assessment of exactly how far you're willing to go to defend yourself, because security does cost money. We all realize that, and I've yet to find the first person for who the money is infinite. So you need to make choices, and whether or not something is overkill should be based on your own assessment of, okay, so is it worth it to go through this length, or is that, financially, am I investing so much and there's really not enough to defend to warrant this? So that's a question I cannot answer for you. But if you want to keep something safe, then taking not a 3-layer approach, but just a staggered approach is a long tried and tested and very useful way of doing it. Basically, every security measure that you have can be defeated. And what you want is that some next security feature will step in when that happens. So that's why you would want to do that. But yeah, again, I can't look inside your wallet. I can't determine if it's overkill. That's entirely dependent on what you're trying to defend and what that's worth to you.
We have a follow-up of the previous question. We hear a lot of XDR today that helps with investigating the cyber kill chain. Can this augment the endpoint security?
Well, I mean, data lake, it really depends on how you put that into context, as usual in this kind of discussion. If you use it right, then data can be a friend, right? So the biggest downside of having a SIEM is you'll be swamped with so much information from so many systems. Every system that you tie it into has a lot to say, especially Microsoft Server is considered, a very chatty operating system, which means that it has a lot to say and it's very verbose. And if you don't tune that before you get it into your SIEM, you get swamped with data that are useless. And okay, I'm getting some clarification. Data lake provided by the security vendor. Yeah, if you're talking about the patterns for pattern recognition or heuristics data or threat intelligence, what they usually call it now, yeah, it's definitely useful because they strip the malware for all kinds of IPs and URLs that are being used in an attack, and most attacks are used. They use the infrastructure of cybercrime gangs. So if you know what that infrastructure is, then and you block that from your network, then by definition you're crippling any kind of attack coming from there or going there. So that's always good news. And this is usually called cyber threat intelligence or threat intelligence. They always give a nice buzzword to it. But basically, when we talk about intelligence feed, we talk about known bad IPs, known bad URLs, and known bad behaviors. So for certain applications, we know that, hey, if this moves in that way, then we know we have an attacker on the network, for instance. And if you call it data lake provided by the security vendor, if that's what it is that you're referring to, then yes, yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. Yeah, and it's also why you usually have to pay for this privilege. Yeah.
Okay, we have an additional question coming in. Lately, we get more and more business questions to expose data or applications to the internet. Think about mobile devices needing access to these applications. We try each time to offload to DMZ by reverse proxy and perform an authentication on DMZ level before a connection can go through to the internal network.
Yeah, that's right.
However, those applications do not always work well with reverse proxy authentication, or it isn't end user friendly with a partner or vendor can't resolve, and the business gives pressure to open it up anyway. What would you recommend to us on how to answer to our business in such cases? Coming with technical risks don't really sway the business.
Yeah, God, man, I can just feel you. I've had this problem so many times. Basically, I don't know what kind of. We've discussed the attendees and what positions they're usually in, but I can't assess the level of technical knowledge of everyone hearing this. But so it might be preaching to the choir, but getting your point across to senior management. Usually you have to pay for something and you need the money. So, hey, management, give me this money to fix this, and convincing them is one of the hardest parts of our job. And so I'm just reading this case that you're telling me here, It's very recognizable. I've had this at countless clients.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question indeed. It's part of the problem, of course, that by adding these applications, by adding more and more things that you or applications that need to be accessed from outside of your network, you're basically punching your perimeter to a point where it's like I'd say it's where there's so many holes in there that you can't call it a safe perimeter anymore, actually. And that's where the SIEM and SOAR story of Don comes in, of course, that you cannot trust prevention alone anymore. Another trend that we see in the business is that people start moving towards zero trust, where you don't put all your trust in a safe perimeter anymore, but you start adding layers of protection to the applications, to your end users, to the identity that they have, so that you can trust who is connecting, that you can trust that the endpoint itself is not malicious, and that you can trust the application, that it's not easy to hack. And this concept, moves a bit the protection from the perimeter to the things you really need to protect, actually. So that could be a way.
The question here is rather specific, and also it's a very generic problem, which I've gone into the last part of that. But what you're basically saying, you have a multitude of issues here, and basically this is the result of going to the cloud, of basically connecting more and more systems, and providing services to the outside. And the downside of that is that you get in between having your own data center and having everything in the cloud. And now most companies are with one leg in both, and they are very different approaches to networking. And the problem is likely that you're trying to catch this migration, if I might call it that, with technology and with a structure that it wasn't designed with that in mind. So it's not impossible, but I would suspect that your solution to this particular issue would be in the direction of redesigning your network, or getting a service in between that. Right now I have a client, and I can't name them, which is too bad because it might be useful for you, but they work in a larger interconnection of companies like that, and they have like an ADFS on steroids between all of these parties. So if they want to connect some SaaS service to their AD, they don't have to allow direct connection with their AD, but they can say, hey, you talk to this federation service here, and they'll give you a very stripped down version of ADFS that is just enough for you to work with, and it's secure for us because we know certain data won't ever be transmitted. And this would actually be quite useful for you as well. I'm just not entirely sure if something like that is available on the commercial market. I don't know what business you are in, Matthias, but if there's anything like an industry overlapping group there, they might have enough pull to get something developed like that, or maybe buy something that might be out of any one person's price range. It's an interesting case. If you ever want to spar about it, let me know. I'll gladly talk to you one-on-one on this. But trying to convince business is something that is very recognizable, and I wish it was easier, but it's never easy to get someone to convince them to pay for something that they don't really want. So I feel you on that level. I hope this was any kind of attempt in answering your question. Yeah, you're definitely not alone. I think what you're experiencing is universal to everyone in security. We should get like a self-help group here. Might get some therapy for security people.
Thank you for the answer. I don't see any new questions popping up. Of course, you can still ask questions by getting in contact with Proximus through proximus.be/securitycontact. We will end the webinar for today. Thank you for attending. and we look forward to seeing you at one of our next webinars.
Excellent. Bye all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Proximus. Think possible.